Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to the podcast. Enough about me with me, Lewis Brown. We are getting a bit political on the show today. We're speaking to Zack Polanski. He is the deputy leader of the Green Party. He's also a member of the London Assembly. Please do like and subscribe and enjoy the conversation. Hello, Zack.
Hello.
How are you doing?
I'm very good. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
How are
Thank you
you?
for coming. I'm good. I was just complimenting your shoes.
Thank you very much.
A nice shiny pair of Doc Martens.
What I like is they're shiny, but they're also a bit muddy from the cycle here, which feels like quintessential green. I like every cliche all in one.
Very green. Yeah, I loved it when you rocked up on your bike. I was waiting for you at the train station thinking he's coming, but no, green as ever, cycling in. So you are the deputy leader of the Green Party. This election last year was the first national election that you had as deputy leader. Is that right? And can you just talk a little bit about that experience? Like you obviously you came from the gig economy. You've done lots of different types of jobs. How did being in the leadership of a national party compare? What were the challenges? How was that for you?
The first thing I'd say, I guess, and this is to any gig economy worker, no job has ever been harder than being a waiter. And I just think that's important to say, actually, like when the people who are serving your food or who are doing those jobs day in, day out, that can be grueling, where you might have a boss that's, I don't know if I'm allowed to swear. Anyway, I won't swear. A boss that's difficult. Some of those jobs, no job is harder. Being deputy leader of a political party has like an intensity to it, and it's a different kind of intensity. So I'm not saying it's easy, but I also think sometimes we can romanticize jobs. And actually, I think jobs that are day-to-day serving people are some of the most difficult jobs I've ever had, like remembering people's orders, dealing with customers, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, this election was intense. I think it was particularly intense from the media. I think they couldn't quite decide and still don't know if the Green Party, some of them would paint us as a kind of not a serious party that aren't going to win anything. We're not a threat to anything. Yet we got nearly 2 million votes. On the other hand, the party and me more specifically are a dangerous threat to democracy in our society. And that starts to sound incredible too. And I think the left and right spectrum is becoming less interesting in my mind. The more interesting spectrum is establishment and anti-establishment. And I think we've seen in the Labour Party and the Conservative Party a conflation between those two parties that are essentially starting to stand for the same thing. Not always, and I would always say the Labour Party are marginally better than the Conservative Party, but I think even that is becoming more and more difficult. The problem with being anti-establishment is that we also know Reform are anti-establishment. Nigel Farage is anti-establishment. So there's this real kind of complexity in politics at the moment of recognising that Nigel Farage is a pretty effective communicator. I mean, to be clear, I cannot stand his politics. We pretty much disagree on everything. But when it comes to defining the problems in society right now in terms of our institutions, democratic credibility, mistrust in the police, all of these kind of things are true. And I think that's where the establishment have made these things true. What we need in the Green Party and the left more broadly is to say, yes, these things are true, but the solutions he offers are solutions that will only benefit the 1%, the multimillionaires and billionaires. And actually what we really need is a redistribution of wealth, a new contract with people, more rights for workers, to make sure that we have less top-down politics, more grassroots politics. And I think all of those things, that's a narrative that's waiting to be grabbed, and I think we can grab it. But it's just about people realizing that just because the establishment has failed doesn't mean we can't rebuild it. We can't give in to despair, and I think that's what Farage is offering, is despair and fear and toxicity and racism.
Yeah, exactly. Well, yeah, I watched a clip of Lewis Goodall on his newsagents podcast, right? And he was saying that the Greens in my opinion, right, quite rightly say that the media gives all this attention to Farage, to kind of Reform or UKIP or Brexit Party or whatever it is. And from my opinion, it's Nigel Farage has been on my TV solidly for 15 years. And so I understand where he's coming from. But then he said, to the Greens complaint, the Greens should get better at getting the attention. What would you say to someone like Lewis Goodall who says it's not their fault, it's nature?
It's complicated. So he's half right, and I think it's important to say that. So first of all, my caveat is I accept some of the criticism. However, how dare he? He is someone who he last interviewed me in 2022 for probably less than 4 minutes on LBC. It was a good interview that I would say that they clipped and did well on LBC. So it's not like I went on and they didn't get any traction from it. People were interested in what I had to say. Never been invited for newsagents. I've not been on LBC for a long time. The last time I was on LBC, I was on with the political editor of the Daily Telegraph. I won't even say her name, so I don't want to promote her. She's not particularly known. But she called Palestinian marches hate marches. She then said, "You can't say this without being called a bigot." I said, "That's because it's a bigoted thing to say." She said, "And next I'll be called a racist." And I said, "Well, if you say racist things, then that is..." The host told me I needed to either retract the comment or leave. I told him I was quite happy to leave, and I was gone. They didn't have me back on for months, and they openly said that I was benched. So we've got LBC or the newsagents or that kind of group of commentators who all believe the same things, who often went to the same schools, who are pushing the same narrative, who then have the gumption or chutzpah to say to people like me, "Oh, you can't come on because you're not interesting enough." I was like, "No, what you're saying is you can't come on because we'll have an argument." And I think people are interested in those arguments. I think the Green Party genuinely have important things to say that are outside of the establishment. So if you are thinking, if I was a TV producer or a radio producer, have us on. We'll get you ratings because we're going to say things that will set off commentators and set off centrist politicians. The real reason we're not allowed on is because we are a threat to the establishment. And the establishment also includes mainstream media, not including a lot of the newer breed, Navarro Media, Turn Left, Owen Jones, the people we all know. They're doing the really important work of having these conversations. But in mainstream media, it's the same conversation, round and round and round in the same narrow frame, which is refugees are coming for your jobs, that they're a danger to society, that there's no money left because the household budget is like the national economy, even though that's a complete nonsense that's been propagated for years. And that we can only have a first past the post system and no one else is allowed to have an opinion. Those are the opinions that are pushed. And so, yes, I accept the criticism that it's my job and the Green Party's job to, even though everyone else is playing politics in easy mode, we are going to have to push harder and be cleverer and smarter and quicker with our comms. I accept that, but also I don't accept it when it comes from the same people who are creating those barriers.
Yeah. The idea of it being like the establishment versus everyone else, like, and you mentioned those kind of like narratives about refugees, about kind of how the economy works. And one thing that I'm finding, like, just as like a normal guy living my life, right, is that it doesn't actually feel, even though we had an election and it was a huge election and it was a huge landslide victory or whatever, it doesn't actually feel like we have a different government.
For sure.
It's kind of weird like that. It just feels like they just changed the guys over and we just have the same stuff. The Labour Party won an election with a drop in the vote share, a drop in their votes. Why should people who were previously kind of like supportive of the Labour Party, or kind of like Liberals or whoever, voting Tory, whatever, why should they go to the Greens?
It's like my favorite question ever. Well, I think first of all, I'll start with the negatives, and I won't. I think we can't just be in despair. We have to offer hope and alternative. But let's look at first of all what this Labour Party are. They're a party that are backing a two-child benefit cap, the same policy that pretty much every expert in child poverty ever says lifting that could take millions of children out of poverty. They say we can't do it because there's no money left. But at the same time, when you ask them about a wealth tax, just 1% on multimillionaires or billionaires, they say, oh, we don't need to do that because our economic plans don't require it. So they are being very clear what their priorities are. Their priorities are not children who have done absolutely nothing wrong, who could be living in homelessness or starvation, because they don't want to be any threat to capital. They don't want to be a threat to big business. We've got a party where we have sewage being pumped into our waters by water companies who are giving millions, if not billions of pounds to their shareholders and CEOs, yet they won't nationalise it because it might be too expensive or it's not quite the right thing to do. We've got a party that have been complicit in a genocide and they are still arming Israel and still won't, Keir Starmer went out on TV and said that Israel had the right to cut off food, water, electricity from the Palestinians. He said that's not what he meant, but Emily Thornberry doubled down just a few hours later. So that's the Labour Party we've got, which I don't see as being any different really to the Conservatives. I also think it's incredibly dangerous because it is creating more disenfranchisement and more disillusionment in the population, which is rolling out the red carpet for Nigel Farage. And this isn't even a hypothetical experiment. Let's look at Joe Biden and Kamala Harris in America. They offered no real alternative. We now have Trump. I think there's a real moment here where people are saying we want a different kind of politics. The Green Party are a different kind of party. We're an entirely democratic party. So whether someone joined the party a month ago or they join after this podcast, they then have one member, one vote. They have as much say as me in our party policy. If someone thinks there's a policy I'd really like to see or I don't agree with one of your policies, we have national conferences where everyone is able to vote. Now, of course, as deputy leader, it's not that I have no say in that. I have a microphone, I have a platform, and I use that platform to influence and steer the party. But ultimately, it is up to democracy and the membership to decide where the party wants to go. That is so different from the Labour Party and the Conservative Party, which is top down, which is the leader says this, that's what happens. Even on some key issues, the Labour membership say, we want this. Keir Starmer goes, nope, not having that. We're doing it my way. I cannot imagine as deputy leader if I tried to not do something that was in the will of the membership. And that's exactly how democracy should be. Now, is that complicated? Is that messy? Absolutely. Sometimes it would be much easier for me to be some sort of dictator and go, this is my opinion. I'm not listening to the membership. It's much cleaner that way. But that's not the way we get through. That's not the way we make sure minority voices are lifted up or people who have been totally unrepresented are lifted up. That's exactly how we disenfranchise them and maintain the status quo is doing what we've always done. We've got to do things differently. And if that includes making things messy, if that includes creativity, then I think that has to be a part of the mix. And sure, we will trip along the way, I am sure. But ultimately, tripping is, it's creating a different kind of alternative. And that is so needed right now.
Yeah, I mean, we need to try something different. But yeah, I want to go on a bit of a pivot,
Right.
right? Because obviously this podcast is called Enough About Me. Let's talk about you. So I want to know a bit about Zack, right? And one thing in my research that I didn't realize, because I've known you for a few years, right?
Long time.
I didn't realize that you actually changed your name back to Polanski because, like, I don't know if people watching at home, but like I've had a friend who had the same thing. His family came from what the Russian Empire, what would have been what's now Belarus, and anglicized their name when they came because of like anti-Semitism and
Right.
stuff like that, and trying to get by. So what made you make that decision to go like to change back?
Yeah, so as you say, there's a very like common experience in the Jewish diaspora and lots of diasporas, in fact. And interestingly, initially when I knew that my name had been changed, because of the kind of the nature of the Holocaust and what happened, the stories are always quite confused. So speaking to grandparents, you would sometimes hear different versions of stories. And so I grew up always, the story in my mind was we changed our name to evade the Nazis. I know we were in Ukraine at some point, Lithuania at another point, and presumably at some point made it to Poland with the name Polanski. And so I wanted to change it back to kind of as my kind of response to historic Nazis, but frankly, present day Nazis as well, and the rise of fascism. This was about me reclaiming and saying I'm not going to be ashamed anymore. After I reclaimed it, I then have done more research and found out exactly what you just said. This was not to do with the Nazis. This was to do with my great grandparents arriving in Manchester and facing anti-Semitism and wanting to escape the anti-Semitism and changing their name. And I think that is an important distinction because anti-Semitism still exists in society, as Islamophobia still exists in society, and racism. And I think it's important to keep having that conversation at the same time as having a conversation about colonialism and empire and the roots of who we are as a country. Because I think if you don't know your history, then how are you going to paint, or create a better future? Also interesting, I don't think I've told this story before, but after I changed it to Polanski, I've since found out it was probably Polinsky. And then I was like, I'm not going to change my name another time. But again, this is quite common because in documents, when people are evading Nazis or oppressors, handwriting is blurred. People are writing different things on different documents. So it's never quite clear in terms of my ancestry. And I would be more interested to dig it out. But essentially, it was partly a reclaiming. I guess the second part, if giving a very honest answer to this, is 18, I was starting to get really involved with drama and acting. And my surname was Paulden. And just like, it's not a good surname. People are like, well, what did you say? People start calling you Paul. So, I mean, you'll have been through this experience too. And lots of actors, like, you look for different names or stage names. And like, it just felt like a very obvious time to go, while I'm changing my name, let's go back to this old name.
Yeah, I mean, I remember I went through a period where I wanted to change my name because I didn't want my slave name, but then I got my name from my white side of my family, so I didn't have a slave name. I was going to go around calling myself Lewis X.
Oh, I like it.
That didn't last. That didn't last very long. You mentioned Manchester.
Starting a campaign to change it.
Could you imagine me with Lewis X? No. I think I'd literally just watched the Denzel Washington Malcolm X film. You mentioned Manchester. You mentioned Manchester has is it like the second biggest like population Jewish community in the country? And you also mentioned like anti-Semitism and the kind of anti-Semitism. I remember from my Jewish friends growing up, the kind of casualness of anti-Semitism that was about. And it wasn't really till I was older where I look back and like even just like jokes that we would do, you know how kind of like the same with homophobia, right?
Totally.
It was kind of very casual. Can you talk a little bit about like growing up in the Jewish community in Manchester?
Yeah, I think because I was in such a sheltered Jewish community, I went to a Jewish school.
Okay.
Anti-Semitism wasn't on my radar in the same way, and it's everything you just said is absolutely true, or I believe it to be true. But I think because I didn't have a lot of non-Jewish friends, there wasn't a lot of like anti-Semitism to be experienced. Then when I went to secondary school, which wasn't a Jewish school, that's when I first started to experience and notice it, particularly because there was like a Christian prayer service, and I wouldn't go to that.
Mm.
About me and about literally 12 of the kids, and then probably a school of 1,000, I'm guessing, would go into a separate classroom where we would have our Jewish assembly. And so while I respect, like, I understand what the school's intention was, but there was nothing more othering, I guess, than just like suddenly going into this other kind of room and everyone knowing you're in that room.
Oh, really? So that wasn't even a choice of like your family and you? It was...
Good question. I'd be dishonest if I replied to that because I can't remember. It's too far ago that I can't remember if it was like. I think it probably was my choice. I think I probably felt quite uncomfortable about like sitting in the room and praying to a God that I didn't believe in or didn't understand. And so I think I probably did want to be in that other room. But I think it was a mixture of that plus being queer, feeling all of those experiences that just meant I was quite heavily bullied. And so there was like a real sense of I just absolutely hated school. Like everything I could hate about school, I really hated. And I think it was partly that experience. I think it was also partly the school. Like now my number one love is like I love to learn. Like talk to me about any topic, history, like a language, like I want the papers, I want to watch a movie about it, I want to watch a documentary. Like I love to learn. And it's really interesting that I dislike school so much, particularly languages, whereas now I love to learn a language. And I just think if you were trying to create a system in which children felt othered or felt like they weren't able to be in a space where they could breathe and learn and be their individual self, you would create a lot of the school systems we have in this country, not all, but the kind of mainstream ones. And I just think that was so deeply damaging. And it wasn't until at 15 I joined Manchester Youth Theatre, which is sadly gone now.
Okay.
But essentially, it was a group of, I was on a scholarship. So it was like a real mix of like kids that had come from like really wealthy backgrounds to kids who'd absolutely come from the estates and everything in between. And I was definitely in between. Staying in Manchester University for like 3 weeks and just being allowed to run wild around the student halls, but also working on theatre and creating theatre topics. And I think that was when I first realized there was a name for what I was feeling, which was gay. It was the first time that I realized that I wasn't unfriendable and that I made friends, that you found that kind of sense of self-worth and all of that kind of stuff. So Manchester Youth Theatre like has such a transformational like home in my heart. And it's why I still think to this day, and I imagine this will be music to your ears. I know my audience, but creatives, artists, like that space where people can be anything they want to be, even if it's just for a short period of time, and then they have to go back to sometimes the horribleness of their lives or whatever they're trying to escape from. Just giving people the freedom, whether it's through music or art or being on stage, to be able to go, I am not what the world tells me to be, then we can really be something. And it just reminded me of something else. So I saw a really good friend yesterday who I know you know, Ricky Beadle Blair, an amazing writer and director. And he said to me, there's 3 people that we're always trying to be in life if we're not watching ourselves. We're who we want to be ourselves, who other people are telling us to be, and who we're trying to be for other people. And it's so important to find the clarity. It's important to recognize what other people think about you too. I'm not saying shut that off entirely, but sometimes it's home back in with who am I, what do I want, and what is it I'm working for or fighting for or challenging. And I just think art and creativity gives such a shortcut to that.
Yeah, like what you said about learning, like I hated school
Right.
as well, but I love learning, and my life was so difficult at that period of time that like focusing on like the pressure of like you have to do these exams and go to this school at this time and it's going to affect the rest of your life was like how is that going to work? I have no idea. But yeah, what I wanted to ask was, oh no, yeah, you said language. What languages do you
I
speak?
speak Italian. I mean,
Speak Italian. Italian.
conversationally, I mean,
Ciao.
don't be in my ciao. Come stai? Yeah, don't be in my DMs, anyone like having to
Trying
have
to
full on Italian conversation.
yeah.
But yeah, I can get through. I actually lived in Italy for a short period of time. I was on tour as an actor doing theatre and
Yeah,
education.
yeah, yeah.
For those who don't know what theatre and education is, it's the kind of going into schools and doing performances. It often gets a really bad rap. Like I can't speak for you, but I don't know, speak for other actors. Like it's considered like the thing you do when you failed as an actor. Like you're not on TV or film. This is what some people say, or you're not
No, I know
kind
that.
of
Yeah.
shows. I have never felt more alive and loved more doing theatre and education. And actually, I think probably more than anything, it was the number one training for politics. Because when you are performing, particularly if it's a workshop, so less performing but interacting with young people, particularly teenagers, they will let you know what they think without filter. And I think that is so important to learn to listen, to learn to engage, to learn to adapt to an audience, to learn to take feedback. And yeah, I was doing a theatre and education project in Italy for 3 years, but not continuously. And that's when I kind of learned Italian.
That's really important, I think, because you said like for people who've like experienced like bullying or some kind of othering and they feel separate, yeah, you then go into politics and you have to like drop those prejudices about people and hear people where they're at. Was there a moment where you decided, okay, I need to get into politics? What did that happen? Because you obviously you had this career before, you were an actor.
Yeah.
What was the moment where you were like, I want to get involved in politics?
Yeah, I think there were a couple of moments. I want to argue with what you just said, though. I love an argument. I can't really argue.
That's
And
different.
just about that, as a politician, you kind of got to drop everything and just listen to people. And I think that's dangerously what politics is becoming. I always think back to Gordon Brown calling that woman a bigot.
Oh no, yeah, oh my God, can you imagine? Like, ruining the country for 14 years.
Right. Yeah. And she was a bigot. And I think I'm not I'm not advocating for like name calling or like running around telling everyone they're a bigot. But I also feel like the way that Gordon Brown immediately kind of was horrified that what he'd said in a private moment had been publicized, and then kind of I think he went round to her house to apologize.
Yeah, yeah.
Apology, kind of a whole complicated discourse now. Apology was probably appropriate because he didn't say it to her face; he said it privately, and he was the prime minister, powerful man talking about someone behind their back. But also, I think that kind of sense of when people say problematic things or things that are blatantly not untrue, as a politician, you can't challenge them. I think that's really corrosive to our politics.
Yeah, I guess I agree. I agree. I guess what I meant by that was when someone say so that woman, for example, what is she called, Gillian or whatever,
Yeah.
she was a bigot, right? And she was saying bigoted stuff about whatever it was, migrants, whatever it was. But that doesn't mean that like I'm not your representative and I don't think you should have access to good healthcare. I don't think your town should be, because I think there's a tendency for people on the left side of the spectrum to be like, oh, that town is a shithole town full of racists, who gives a shit?
For sure.
Rather than being like, oh, these are actually people. And yeah, they might be bigger, but they still deserve like bus routes and schools and like economy, I guess.
Absolutely, especially as it come from a sense that people aren't born with those prejudices.
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
there's so much research around that. Those prejudices are learned, and they're often learned through scarcity and through austerity and the conditions, exact conditions that from Thatcher through Blair, through Cameron and Clegg, and increasingly now through Starmer have been created that are causing some of those divisions. So a lot of it is not those people's fault, particularly if they haven't had the opportunity to be informed or educated about those things. So yeah, I'm not suggesting for a second that you go around calling people names, but I do think there is a robustness that is sometimes missing from politics. And I'll give you an example of where I think this has been dealt with really well. And Nicola Sturgeon, who I know is a more complicated character recently, but particularly around trans rights, I really respected that she did not budge. And there was that sense of where she was interviewed, and I think an interviewer put to her, "You've got all these women who say they're gender critical," and that's a whole nother conversation about what that phrase means. Um, but said so, that not listening to them, they feel really strongly about this, and she just kind of took it in and said, I feel equally strong about this. And it was just that kind of your passion and your intensity does not cancel out my right to have an opinion and perspective. And yes, you're absolutely right. You still listen to people with passion and intensity, but just because people are coming at you with an opinion does not mean you immediately go, oh, okay, I was wrong. I'm
Yeah.
going with you with your opinion. And I think, that's focus group mentality. And we see government run with that constantly. There's anger in the country about this. There's anger in the country about refugees. So rather than showing moral leadership and pointing out that if you're using the National Health Service, the person who is treating you or caring for you is so much more likely to be an immigrant than anyone in front of you in the queue, these stories are not being told. And they're not being told because politicians too often are scared to challenge problematic narratives. And so, wow, I've really dug into your.
No, that's
Really
good. That's good. I think one way in which you go against the kind of grain of like mainstream politicians and you take a lot of like bile for is your stance towards Palestine, right? And you mentioned it earlier. Do you call yourself an anti-Zionist?
No, I don't. Um, and it's interesting because I think these positions are always evolving, and I think these things are very complicated. I think there's a conversation that really needs to be had, a national conversation about what is Zionism, how would you define it? Because when you speak to different people, there's always lots of different versions of it. For me, the baselines are quite simple: that you cannot have anyone living in a place where they are occupied, where they're oppressed, where they do not have equal rights. Now, I think there's a legitimate conversation about what is the ideology, or how do you create something that both protects Israel's right to exist and Palestine's right to exist, and what is the name of that? And I think that that is not up for politicians in the UK to decide. And so I'm avoidant of that term because I'm avoidant of any term actually that seeks to categorize what should happen in that space beyond my values and what I should say should be everyone's values, which is equal rights. Now, if that sounds like word salad, I guess as I'm saying it, I'm like, that's a very complicated statement. Let me put it another way. Palestinians and Israelis should decide what happens for the future of that region. It should not be for the Israelis, who clearly hold the power in this situation, to decide unilaterally. And that's where third party countries were vital in that, in being able to hold that space and hold those negotiations and hold that conversation. And how you do that in a war torn country with decades of occupation and oppression is an incredibly complicated question. But that's why we need much greater moral leadership and courage than has ever experienced in order to how to do this. Just to be clear in the answer to your question, I don't categorize myself as a Zionist either. It's just that I don't wake up in the morning and my number one kind of mission isn't, how do I bring down Israel? That's not what I'm trying to do here. My number one mission, amongst all the other things I'm trying to do in politics, is how do we bring equal rights, peace, and egalitarianism to people living side by side. And I heard, I can't remember who it was to credit it, but I heard recently a commentator, a journalist say, we'll really know when we've got there when there is an Israeli embassy in Palestine and a Palestinian embassy in Israel. And it's no longer a problem because actually they are two neighbors that live side by side. Will they be best friends? Probably not. I don't imagine so. But I also think you don't need to be best friends to be neighbors. You just need to be able to live in peace and be able to have diplomatic relations with each other. And that's the place I'd like to see us get to. How we get there, I've just been talking about truth and honesty. I don't have an easy answer for that.
Right.
But I don't think it's for politicians in other countries to come up with the answers. I think it's for us to hold a space where there can be a conversation about that. We are, with Palestinians and Israelis, we are so far from that space at the moment because people are being oppressed and occupied. And there is nowhere near equal terms. So I'm often criticized, including by my own Jewish community, that in some ways I'm being one-sided about this. I don't think I'm being one-sided about this. I want peace for Israelis too. But when you look at that situation right now, there is such a disproportionality in power, and we are not selling arms to Hamas, or at least not anymore. We are selling arms to Israel. And so I think as a British politician, my responsibility and my power and influence, limited as it is, has to be aimed at
Well, our ally. We call him the ally.
yes,
right?
exactly that. And it's when Rishi Sunak stood next to Netanyahu and said, we hope you win. No one's winning there. Death and destruction is winning there. We've got to get out of this winning and losing.
Can you just speak to that, what you just spoke about, which was being a Jewish person and the criticism you get from inside of your community? And I know that because I mentioned Zionist because you'll hear a lot of the time, obviously you don't have to be Jewish to be a Zionist, but I'll hear a lot of the time 90-80%, whatever it is, of Jewish people are Zionists. So to be anti-Zionist is to like this stuff. And I think, how have you navigated being Jewish and your voicing your concerns around Palestine?
Yeah, I want to caveat the whole answer with Palestinians have been going through a genocide that is unimaginable. And so I'm going to talk about my pain in a second, but I want to caveat it with, of course, the Palestinian voices need to be centered here. You're asking me a question about me, so I'm going to, enough about me. I'll answer about me, but I just wanted to put that out there. It's been incredibly difficult and it's been painful because um, to have what should be considered your family, I'm talking about the much wider community, to be the people who have your back, to love you, to feel like you are part of that community, even when you disagree, is part of what family is. But I have received, of all the most vociferous criticism, insults, and frankly threats that I've received in my career as a politician, the vast majority have come from within the Jewish community. And as I'm saying that out loud, that's wild. That's so painful. There have been a huge amount of Jewish people who have supported me, who have amplified my voice, and I've amplified theirs, and I've been incredibly grateful for that. Particularly want to shout out Namod, who are a group of Jews who are speaking out against the occupation. And to come to your last question, I've always struggled with the question around Zionism because I grew up in what was essentially a Zionist community. And so when I increasingly felt uncomfortable about that, I also felt increasingly uncomfortable with the idea that I was anti-Zionist because when you look at the kind of history of Zionism, it was to combat or challenge oppression and the Holocaust and to find a safe space for people. It was a fundamentally left-wing and socialist idea that over time has been being distorted as an understatement. And so it's just been a complicated question about words that evolve, and I just didn't have an answer to it because I was like, I'm not a Zionist, I'm not an anti-Zionist. And it was Namod that were really helpful in going, you don't need to be either. You can just say clearly that you're not pro this and you're not anti this, you're for peace and human rights. And so that's been really helpful to have so many people in the Jewish community. I really challenge this idea that there is, well, let me start. I'm massively challenged with no doubt the idea that the majority of Jewish people in this country support Netanyahu's government. We just pretty much know that's not true. We know the vast majority of people in this country are very unhappy about the genocide that we're seeing, even if they don't call it a genocide. They're unhappy about seeing the mass killing of innocent civilians. And that's, by the way, why the police response has been so fierce and so top down, because the government know they are complicit. The main opposition know that they are complicit. And so there is a conspiracy between the two of them. And I don't mean this as a conspiracy theory. I think it's quite clear that there is a plan between the two of them where they agree not to disagree about this, because ultimately the number one thing they need to do is to stop the organizing of communities and the majority in this country who are now so far away from where mainstream politics are that is a fracture through the entire establishment of our country. This is not just on Palestine. I would say it's almost very much on the climate crisis, on the issue of workers' rights, on the issue of inequality in our society. We're seeing this increasing distance between a state who need to use the police as the essentially violent force often of the state, not always violent, but particularly for Black and brown communities, to oppress the challenge to their authority.
Yeah.
We're seeing that.
Can you talk about that actually? Because obviously we've just seen, at the time of recording this interview, you've just seen the past weekend these marches that were like heavily policed. They tried to ban them. You're seeing more kind of attacks on the freedom of expression and freedom of speech, essentially, of people who support Palestine, and then you're getting that state violence involved as well. Can you just talk about like that experience, what's happening right now with these marches?
Yeah, I mean, it's horrendous. I think, first of all, the whole discourse around it is a tactic in itself. So I think it's created suppression. When I speak to people who would normally be at those marches, particularly talking about older people, although I acknowledge that there's lots of older people who are the fiercest warriors of all. I mean, warriors in a peaceful way who are still on those marches. But there's lots of people, like I spoke to someone yesterday whose parents would normally be at them, and I said, "Oh, your parents coming today?" And they said, "No, they just didn't want to be kettled, for hours." And I get that. So, first of all, I think the suppression is a tactic in itself of changing the routes, saying you can't do this, you can't do that. The whole discourse has been around the disruption of a synagogue. The synagogue was never on the route. It was never proposed to be on the route. I, as a Jewish person, would never, literally never advocate for disrupting a synagogue. It's just something I would not do. And also, even if the argument was that the BBC, which was the target, was near the synagogue, I think it was half a mile away, the plan was to get to the BBC at like 4 p.m. and the synagogue service finished around 1, half 1. So we're not even talking about the close time. So that's been the first problematic kind of conversation. The second has been arriving at that protest. It's been my experience, but certainly lots of other people too. The aggression from the police even arriving at the protest. This was an entirely peaceful protest where people like myself, Jeremy Corbyn, John McDonnell, Juliet Stevenson, the actor, lots of cultural leaders, people from community groups, how distorted does your worldview have to be to look at someone like Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell, who pretty mild-mannered people, and kind of claim they are enemies of state that are somehow forcing through police? That's incredibly problematic. I've just written a letter to Yvette Cooper today, the Home Secretary, to ultimately call out that the police have lied. And that is, um, I was about to
Won't be
say,
first time.
well, that's what I was about to say. It's a new development in terms of lied on such an institutional scale where the Home Secretary is saying this, but obviously there are lots of stories through the past, whether it's the Hillsborough disaster, but also, again, lots of Black and brown communities, their daily experience with the police. But I mean this much more institutionalized, organized, where the Home Secretary is out there pointing at MPs, pointing at an assembly member, pointing at these civil rights groups and saying, these people are lying, they have forced their way through the police. I immediately countered that on social media when I didn't realize there was going to be video evidence. It's now been very helpful that since I've countered it, the video evidence has now been produced that absolutely demonstrates that what myself and the MPs and the people at that march are saying is true. And actually, the story that's come out from the Metropolitan Police and the Home Secretary is a lie. That is so corrosive to justice. That is so corrosive to a Metropolitan Police Service that is already badly mistrusted. A police service that was found to be institutionally misogynistic, homophobic, and racist. Now, as I say all of this, I worry. Obviously, I worry. It's deeply damaging, but all of this is playing into Farage's hands. This all plays into his idea of two-tier policing, and you can't trust this and you can't trust that. And this is the problem here, is Keir Starmer is rolling out the red carpet to these narratives because he's making these narratives true by eroding trust in grassroots communities. Again, it is our responsibility to both challenge the narrative because you can't just let it lie, but also at the same time point out why Farage's solutions here are not the solutions. And ultimately what we need is a return to basic principles and a return to amplifying grassroots voices and those voices that we should be caring about. And, why are we hearing from Elon Musk and I was going to say Nigel Farage and all of those voices? Why are we not hearing from grassroots leaders, community leaders? Why are we not hearing from the people who are out there daily doing the work and really making a change in their society? And we just don't see or hear from those stories.
Right.
And that's so problematic. But the last thing I just wanted to say, it comes back to 2 questions ago, is around the Jewish community. That for all my negativity towards some of the establishment that have rallied around the idea of weaponizing our Jewishness and weaponizing anti-Semitism, there are so many other Jewish people who are in a long tradition and history of left-wing socialist Jews who are saying we stand with our brothers and sisters in Palestine, we stand with oppressed people all around the world. And I'm just so proud of those people doing that work because they are putting their head above the parapet. The establishment will do everything they can to cancel them, to create mistrust around their narratives, to challenge the things they say or do. And I think all of us, every citizen in this country, needs to stay focused and not get distracted.
Yeah, I'm very glad you said about the weaponization. And I think that's important to remember because I am very much a believer of having compassion for people and essentially the Jewish community is being gaslit a lot of the time and weaponized and used as political football by people who have no interest in their well-being. And I like my multicultural country and I like the fact that we have British Jewish communities that enrich our country, and I love bagels. So let's just let's just remember that. Yeah, have compassion for people, but I'm conscious of time, so I don't want to do a hard pivot. I was looking for the thing, but as well as being deputy leader of the Green Party, you are a London Assembly member, and obviously the Green Party is focused on climate, on environmentalism, and I think if I researched right, you are the chair of the environment committee.
Can I challenge your question again, though? Because I am one of those challenges.
Go for it. Go for it. Go for it.
So, climate and environment has to be at the center of everything
Yeah.
because it's an existential threat to our planet. But I think there is often a misconception that the Green Party, because the title is green, is only focused on climate and the environment. But actually, a huge amount of our work is around renters' rights, about police reform,
Oh yeah, of course.
about legalization of drugs, about I know you know that, but I'm just always aware when there's a microphone and people watching things that it's always really important to say the climate crisis is intersectional. And actually, we've talked a lot in this conversation about immigration and refugees. We know that the climate crisis is going to affect the global south. It is already affecting the global south disproportionately. In fact, the people who have done the least to cause the climate crisis are the worst affected by it.
Yeah.
So I'm always keen that people know that the Green Party is focused on the environment and the climate, but we are focused on it through the lens of inequality and through intersectionality, and ultimately making sure that we're dealing with all of these other things too.
Cool. What does preparing for or fighting climate breakdown look like on a city level? If you're like a London Assembly member, you're thinking, because you're thinking on global stage, what does it actually look like on a city level? What is going on there?
So here's a hopeful thing here. If we lived in a society that was completely equal and there was no inequality whatsoever in society, and then we suddenly discovered the climate crisis, it would be a really hard ask for a politician to say, we've got to change everything, because people would go, I'm really comfortable and satisfied in life, don't change things. We don't live in that scenario at all. We live in a scenario where there is mass poverty, particularly in London, but also around the country, particularly again in the north and in Wales, but lots of pockets everywhere really, where we have this inequality that we need to tackle. And we need to completely change our cities because we need to be more resilient, we need to adapt, and we need to mitigate our emissions. This is a moment where we can both tackle inequality and the climate at the exact same time. So what does that look like? So one of the huge problems is around people heating their homes. Cost of living crisis. People can't afford to pay their bills. I keep saying cost of living crisis. It's really an inequality crisis. Lots of people can afford to pay their bills. Multimillionaires and billionaires, again, were making more money than they ever have before in the pandemic, while people were struggling to, particularly if they had a meter, it was like they were being punished for being in poverty, and it kind of doubled down. So we need to reduce people's bills. One of the best ways you can do that is through insulating people's homes. We have some of the leakiest homes in Europe. Insulating homes reduces people's bills, reduces climate emissions, and it also creates good green jobs. How do we get cities that are ready for the climate emergency? We create jobs in green industries that are needed to be created anyway. We make sure they're in the public sector, that they are organized within trade unions so people are being paid properly, they have decent working conditions, they have a say and a stake in how society is formed and how it is moved. I think ultimately that's how we tackle the climate crisis. There's loads of other things to do too. Let's ban private jets. That can sound like a small fry, but a private jet takes off, I think it's every 12 minutes. That is the pinnacle of climate injustice. I supported the ULEZ. In fact, it was a Green Party idea to reduce traffic in London. I know not always popular, and I get that because you're asking people to reduce the amount they drive at the same time that there are private jets flying above the skies, mocking people in poverty beneath them. So there's a real dissonance between some of the things that we're asking people to do, particularly in poorest communities, while the super rich are getting away with things. This is going to be the same with boilers in people's homes, with making sure that we are changing the ways people get about. We need people to be on public transport. If you're going to be on public transport, it needs to be in public hands. It needs to be as cheap as possible. It needs to be as frequent and as comfortable as possible. Right now, if I say to people in outer London, I want you to get on your bike in the same way that I do, that is mass privilege. You know, I live in Hackney, where cycling is pretty easy. Like, we've got really good cycle lanes, so they could always be better, but they're pretty good. If you go to outer London, it feels like a death trap often if you're going to be cycling around there. And if you want to get the bus, you could be waiting a hugely long time compared to inner London. So this idea of levelling up, to coin a phrase that Boris Johnson used, was actually an idea that really needs to happen, both in London, but particularly in poorer cities around the country. It's just that Boris Johnson's version of levelling up was to funnel money to Tory-facing constituencies and make sure they were protected. That was also in this toxic phrase, people who are hard to reach. They're not hard to reach at all. You just haven't made any attempt to connect with those communities. But the fundamental principle of places around the country need infrastructure, they need investment, and they need public investment, which is ultimately about the government spending money to invest in improving and developing these communities so they can create their own wealth, they can create their own cohesiveness, they can create their own sense of community in place, is really, really important. But instead, we're going the opposite way, where that money is being funneled to private business, who are sometimes pretending to invest in the community. I think of places like Stoke that are getting kind of a new arts venue, which is, I can't remember what private company is sponsoring it. It might be O2, which is ultimately killing off local entertainment. It's killing off a local grassroots venue. It is attracting tourism, but that tourism is only going to that private company. It might go to the local hotels, but are they owned locally anymore? No, they're huge chains. And so it's destroying those cities, moving that public money in the sense that we're investing in community, but really it goes to private capital, creating more inequality, more money for multimillionaires and billionaires, whilst more and more people are struggling, creating more disenfranchisement, which creates more austerity, which creates more distrust of the other. And you can see how all of these
Yeah.
circles go on. The good news is it's relatively simple to break. It's just not easy to break because you're challenging those who hold the reins.
Well, you mentioned a bit about cost of living and stuff, and obviously you mentioned like insulation because that's part of like saving energy, but like the rents are
Yeah.
obviously, especially London, like rents are like insane. And I know I've got friends who are like managerial seniorish roles who are living in house shares, right?
Yeah.
And then they're like, why is no one having a family? Why like why is the local economy, nightlife kind of dying? No one has disposable income. And like thousands and thousands of pounds are going to landlords who often don't live in the area. So like money is being extracted from the area. So what is what are you going to do about it,
Yeah,
basically?
first answer is rent controls, but I'll come on to that in a second. When I was first elected to the London Assembly, I was living as a property guardian. I think most people know what this is, but it's
Yeah.
where you live like an old abandoned building for much cheaper rent. And you're often living, I was living with 25 people. That's most people's idea of a nightmare. I'm not telling a sob story here. I actually loved it. So um, I could have probably gone and house shared and rented, but actually I really enjoyed the sense of community. And in fact, when I was elected, someone said to me, they went, "Oh, you're going to go like get your own property now or go rent somewhere?" And I was like, absolutely not. I want to stay living with the people I was living with, which were like delivery drivers, chefs, people working in nightclubs, actors, dancers, because I actually loved the sense of being elected, but also being able to come home and sit and share a meal with Londoners who are doing those things and never forget where I come from.
I mean, I
Um,
like to close the door and be alone.
Admittedly, the next bit of this story is I then met my boyfriend who was like, he's super social, but he was like, 25 people isn't for me. So then, we went off and did our own thing. So I'm not a property guardian anymore. But a lot of those people living in that house weren't like me. They didn't want to live with 25 people. They were forced into those conditions, which, let's be clear, were often cold, no furniture, property guardian owners who can kick you out. I think it's 14 days notice, who can vet your property at any time. And that's how bad renting has got, that people are being forced into those kind of conditions. Obviously, that's relatively privileged on the scale. Some people don't have a home at all. Other people are living in house shares where they're dealing with abuse or domestic violence. So this whole thing is an absolute nightmare and so problematic. Rent controls clearly have to be a huge part of the solution. People always go, where have they ever worked? And I think it's a pretty poor question, because first of all, I think anytime anyone ever says to me, where has that ever worked? I go, we live in a global city that's one of the leading cities in the world, or should be. At the moment, we're leading in inequality. Let's fix that. Let's start looking at other things. If your premise of saying where have rent controls ever worked, I'm going to say to you, when has the system we've got now, right now, of rentierism and capitalism ever worked? Like, we have this system where people are profiting from people's universal credit because they can't afford to pay the rent, which is the government giving money straight to landlords, whilst people who are sometimes working, and I don't think it matters whether they're working or not working. I think that distinction is often made to divide people. But people who maybe want to work or want to do something with their life are having to give that housing benefit to their landlord, who are profiting more. So we clearly need a different kind of system. I think in the meantime, before we get to rent controls, I think we could be doing things like a mandatory register of landlords. Not all landlords are awful. I think you can have landlords who genuinely want to house people, and so they want to keep the price as low as possible. I think that's quite rare, but I think it does exist. I think when we blur them with the landlords who are
Whether that exists or not.
totally. So, even as I'm saying that, because rent controls is kind of I don't think it's radical because I think it's the thing we need to get to. I know people will hear that and go, "You'll never get there," and I want to argue we can get there. But even in the meantime, let's have a mandatory landlord register. So if landlords are taking the piss I said I wasn't going to swear and then broke it, or are exploiting people, let's get them off the landlord register as quickly as possible. If they're blatantly doing that, they should no longer be landlords. So let's make sure that at least the people who are landlords are doing it within the law, are doing it where the people that they're housing aren't feeling like they're being exploited, and they're not just raising their rents or kicking people out through a Section 21 notice or whatever it might be. The renters' bills coming through at the moment. So by the time this is broadcast, just maybe some things will be moderately better. But ultimately, it comes down to what you said about, who cares if they exist? It shouldn't exist. We shouldn't have a system where people profit through being able to hoard the capital of having an asset where they are not charged as much as income tax. And this is why capital gains tax needs to be in line with income tax. That's another thing you can do. You can start to tax unearned wealth at the same rate as income. We are not there at the moment. And I think until we get there, we really need to be talking about rent controls because it's a completely unfair and broken system. That was a very long answer that dealt with lots of different things, but it's a complicated question because you're kind of saying, what would you do today under the system we've got? Where would you like to be in 5-10 years under a Green government? And you've got to tackle both kind of lines at the same time.
Yeah, well, my big idea, I don't know if it's worth anything, but is to tax properties 10% extra every property you own, so that if you own like 5, you're paying 100% tax. Because why is someone owning like 12 houses, and then you've got these massive companies who own like hundreds and hundreds of houses. But anyway, look,
I like it, but I would even say, why should anyone own a second home? That says,
yeah, I get that, but
can I shout out?
I'm not quite.
I want to shout out my amazing colleague on the Assembly, Zoe Garbett, who ran for Mayor of London. She just had a renters commission in City Hall. So basically, she said to the mayor when she ran for mayor, you should have a renters commission. Essentially, this is about bringing the voices of renters, so people like London Renters Union, Acorn, Runnymede Trust, who deal with racial inequality, civil rights groups, simply just people who rent, bring them all together and have this conversation and say, actually, from the voices of renters, what do you want? What does the system look like? The mayor kept saying, I'm not going to do that. That needs to come from national government. He wouldn't show leadership on it. Zoe, I love her, got elected as London Assembly member, and she has held like a pilot renters commission in City Hall where she got these people together. She's putting together those recommendations, and she's going to take it to the mayor and said, where you wouldn't do it, I've done it. These are the recommendations. Now, can she do one like the mayor can? No, he's the mayor of London. He has the power, that convening power, to really make a difference on that and bring all of those voices together. But what I love, and this is what often Greens do, is where we don't have the power to do that huge scale, we go, okay, we're going to run a smaller version to demonstrate this idea and what it can do and demonstrate the difference it can make. And it was so powerful. I was sat in the room just as an observer, watching people talk from their own lived experience about their crappy experiences in this city and other cities too around renting, that this cannot continue, and starting to go, here are some of the solutions we're coming up with. And I think it should come from people rather than politicians.
Yeah. Well, look, we're almost out of time, or we're past time, but
Sorry.
no. Thank you for coming. There's loads I wanted to talk to you about. I was going to ask about UBI and stuff because I know but maybe we'll have you on again at a different point.
Also, be an answer to the renters problem. Let's give everyone a universal basic income. Anyway,
just give me money. But let's do a bit of a quick fire round before we go. Okay, I've just got a few questions for you. What is one policy that you would like to make law if you could just snap your fingers?
Proportional representation. I think if we give everyone a fair vote, this would not solve all the things that we're talking about. But I think until we have a fair voting system where everyone's vote counts, that is very difficult to deal with these things. The caveat to that is in the last election, when the Green Party target seats, we targeted 4 seats, we won 4 MPs. So we've learned to win even under first past the post, but it's not fair, more importantly, for the voter. You shouldn't just be able to get the MP you want because you happen to be in a target constituency. Everyone's vote should count, so proportional representation.
Amazing. Worst politician in the country?
Nigel Farage, I think.
Nigel Farage, yeah, I do.
I mean,
the thing is, it's kind of a good politician, you know what I mean? Keir Starmer, I hate Keir Starmer. He's useless.
Well, I think Jonathan Ashworth, then, actually. I'm just
he's
lost your teeth,
flop.
But he was constantly on the media despite being so dull uninteresting. Tell you, I'm being mean now and then. It's a New Year's resolution to not be mean.
Favorite prime minister?
Probably, I mean, they've all been problematic in some ways, especially if you go back in history, because you'll find it all both in the Mac Empire. But I think Clement Attlee's time, I think, is the kind of time we need to be looking at now to go, what does a complete transformation of society look like that is grassroots led? I accept that it wasn't entirely grassroots led, but I think it was in the right direction.
Least favorite prime minister?
Genuinely, I was about to say Keir Starmer.
The list is long. The list is long.
Yeah, I mean, you could go Liz Truss, Boris Johnson. I mean, it's been pretty. I guess Tony Blair, because it's Margaret Thatcher. I don't know, just literally all.
You know what I mean? It's like anyone that we've had. You know what's funny? I realized that Theresa May was the best prime minister we had since Gordon Brown. That's crazy to think about.
I can hear that. I can hear that.
Isn't that crazy?
I think I'm going to stay with Tony Blair because Margaret Thatcher was so dire, but it could have been a one-off where the country went so wrong that we're never going to do that again. But actually what Tony Blair did was lock in that politics and lock in neoliberalism for the foreseeable future.
And your favorite MP? Now.
Other than Green MPs, or can I go Green?
Go Green MPs.
I mean, Green MP would be Carla Denyer, just because I just think I love the fact that she was not a natural politician in terms of she did not. I guess we've got similar stories in that, apart from it's complete opposite. I'm an artist. She's an engineer and a scientist. But I think that's what we need more of in politics, people who didn't kind of come out of school and go, I want to be a politician. I'm going to become a special advisor. I'm going to go to the right kind of groups. I'm going to do the right kind of. Everything about me is crafted to be a politician. Carla is, and me, I would argue, is the complete opposite of that. Particularly me, I've done some wild and wacky things in the past, and I think that makes me a better politician, I think, because it means I've had lived experiences of working in environments where you go, sure, I was broke and, I was getting through and I was kind of hustling. And I think that's important. That's not me saying Carla was hustling. She's a very respectable scientist. It's just one university challenge too, which is pretty impressive. Not Green though. Zara Sultana, I think, is just doing such an amazing job. Suspended by the Labour Party, and I love that she's taking no prisoners and she's just speaking truth to power, and she is just fearless despite the amount of hate she gets.
Yeah, nice. Well, our final note, because I know you have to get on your bike.
Yeah.
What is a reason for? We live in like really nihilistic times right now. There's a lot of scary things kind of happening, a lot of uncertainty. What is a reason to be hopeful?
I think, the Green Party just got 1.9 million votes. And obviously I'm biased as the Green Party deputy leader, but I'd like to think that even if I wasn't involved with the party, I think that despite the fact there was an onslaught of media to paint us out as anti-Semitism, anti-Semitic, to paint us out as not being able to win, to paint us out as unrealistic, or just to ignore us, 1.9 million people still went to a ballot paper, despite the fact that there was a risk of the Conservatives winning again and Rishi Sunak. There wasn't a real risk, but some people still felt that, and the Labour Party really played on that with, it's either us or the Tories. People still went, no, I'm done with that. I am done with the establishment. I am done with, I like the phrase that whether you vote Team Red or Team Blue, you get Team Fascism. And that's something that they've been saying in America. And I think there's some truth to that. And I love the fact that people went, I'm rejecting that, and actually I am voting Green. And I think if that can build, if the left more widely can build, then I think there is no reason to give up hope. I think there's every reason right now to dig in and go, we are not going away. We are not being silenced, and we're so much stronger together. And I think that is the hope for the future.
Nice one. Thanks, Zach.
Thanks so much for having me.
You're welcome.